The date is August 27, 1990. The Philadelphia spectrum pulsates with 19,000 voices united in anticipation. In the ring, two titans of tag team wrestling prepare for war. The Hart Foundation versus Demolition, a 2 out of 3 falls match for the Tag Team Championship. The stakes couldn't be higher. Demolition, the dominant force that had crushed all opposition, now faced their greatest challenge. And when the final fall concluded, when Jim Neidhart tackled Crush and Bret Hart secured the pin, history crystallized into legend. The Hart Foundation had reclaimed their throne, cementing their status as perhaps the greatest tag team of all time. They had set a standard for in-ring excellence that would echo through decades. Their chemistry was supernatural, their execution flawless, their legacy seemingly unshakable. Yet just 1 year later, at SummerSlam 1991, Bret Hart would stand alone in victory, capturing the Intercontinental Championship, while Jim Neidhart was nowhere to be found at the event. By SummerSlam 1992, Bret headlined the show in a classic against the British Bulldog, a match that should have been perfect except for one haunting detail. Bret would later write in his autobiography that he couldn't reach Davey Boy Smith to prepare because Smith had spent the weeks before the match smoking crack cocaine with Jim Neidhart. The Anvil, once half of wrestling's most celebrated partnership, had descended into a tragic oblivion while his partner ascended to immortality. What happened? How does one half of greatness fall so completely while the other rises so spectacularly? The answer lies not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of choices, circumstances, and the cruel mathematics of professional wrestling, where only one man can be champion, and someone must always be left behind. James Henry Neidhart entered this world on February 8, 1955, and from the beginning he was built differently. At Newport Harbor High School in California, he didn't just participate in athletics, he dominated them. In 1973, he set a California state record in shot put that would stand for 12 years, a testament to the raw, explosive power that would later define his wrestling persona. This wasn't merely strength, it was the kind of primal force that separates the exceptional from the adequate. The NFL came calling, as it must when confronted with such physical specimens, and Neidhart found himself in training camps with the Oakland Raiders and Dallas Cowboys, dancing on the periphery of American football's promised land. But the promise remained unfulfilled. The NFL, in its infinite capacity for producing broken dreams, released him. Most men would have crumbled. Neidhart traveled north to Calgary, to the infamous Hart Dungeon, where Stu Hart transformed men into wrestlers through methods that bordered on medieval torture. The dungeon wasn't a gymnasium, it was a crucible where weakness was burned away and only the resilient survived. Neidhart not only survived, he thrived. More significantly, he fell in love with and married Ellie Hart, Stu's daughter, weaving himself into the very fabric of wrestling's most storied family. From 1978 through the early 1980s, he worked for Stampede Wrestling, capturing tag team gold and developing the fundamental skills that would later captivate millions. It was during this period that Jim Neidhart became the Anvil. Stu Hart, ever the promoter, promised him $500 to enter and win an anvil toss at the Calgary Stampede. Neidhart threw that anvil 11 feet, 2 inches, claiming both the prize and a nickname that would define his career. The Anvil, immovable, unbreakable, the foundation upon which victories were forged. The moniker replaced his earlier designation as the Animal, but in truth both descriptions captured different facets of the same phenomenon. A man who combined bestial intensity with industrial reliability. Neidhart's journey took him across continents, Japan, Germany, the southern United States, accumulating championships and experience. He held the Mid-South Tag Team Championship with Butch Reed. He captured gold in championship wrestling from Florida. He was building an impressive resume, but he remained a journeyman, a talented performer in search of that elusive transcendent moment. That moment arrived in January 1985, when Stu Hart sold Stampede Wrestling to Vince McMahon, and Neidhart, along with brother-in-law Bret Hart, found themselves suddenly property of the World Wrestling Federation. The federation initially positioned Neidhart as a singles competitor under the management of Mr. Fuji, debuting at Madison Square Garden with a victory over Tony Garea. But singles success eluded him, and in one of those fortuitous accidents that occasionally punctuate wrestling history, Bret Hart, frustrated with his assigned cowboy gimmick, suggested they form a tag team. McMahon agreed, and the Hart Foundation was born. Managed by Jimmy Hart, whose surname created delicious confusion, the pink and black-clad duo made their pay-per-view debut at WrestleMania 2, where they were the last two eliminated from a battle royal by Andre the Giant. What followed was magic. The Hart Foundation captured their first Tag Team Championship on February 7, 1987, defeating the British Bulldogs with the dubious assistance of crooked referee Danny Davis. They lost those titles to Strikeforce later that year, but the pattern had been established. The Hart Foundation wasn't just another tag team, they were artists painting violence in the ring. Bret brought technical precision and psychological acuity. Neidhart brought explosive power and that distinctive maniacal laugh that could unsettle opponents and electrify crowds. Together, they pioneered the Hart Attack, a finisher so perfectly executed it became synonymous with tag team excellence itself. The late 1980s saw the Hart Foundation navigate feuds with the fabulous Rougeau brothers, Demolition, and various other contenders. They fired manager Jimmy Hart after he cost them matches, turning the team babyface and making them even more beloved. They defeated the Bolsheviks in 19 seconds at WrestleMania 6. And then came that glorious night in Philadelphia, August 27, 1990, when they recaptured the Tag Team Championship from Demolition in that epic 2 out of 3 falls encounter. The victory felt like vindication, like destiny finally aligning with deserve. But professional wrestling is a business of constant evolution, and evolution favors the adaptable. Bret Hart was adapting. His singles matches at house shows throughout 1989 had revealed something that perhaps had been obvious all along. He was special, a once-in-a-generation performer who could carry any match to greatness. Neidhart had his own singles opportunities, including shots at ravishing Rick Rude's Intercontinental Championship. But the spark wasn't there. He was formidable, certainly, but formidable alone is insufficient in an industry that demands either transcendence or perfect partnership. The Hart Foundation defended their championships through late 1990 and into 1991, including a controversial moment when the Rockers seemingly won the titles, only to have the victory erased from history after a top rope broke during the match and the Federation decided not to air the title change. But cracks were forming in the foundation. At WrestleMania 7, Jimmy Hart, now managing the Nasty Boys, interfered and cost them the titles. Shortly thereafter, Hart and Neidhart split up. Bret was ascending towards singles stardom. At SummerSlam 1991, he defeated Mr. Perfect for the Intercontinental Championship in a match many consider among the greatest of all time. But surprisingly, Neidhart wasn't even on the card. The Federation attempted to salvage Neidhart's career by pairing him with Owen Hart, Bret's younger brother, as the new foundation. They debuted in December 1991 wearing gaudy checkerboard pants, a visual downgrade from the iconic pink and black. Their highlight was defeating the Orient Express at the Royal Rumble in January 1992. But the new foundation lacked the chemistry and credibility of its predecessor. They were a tribute band playing in the shadow of legends. On February 15, 1992, they wrestled their final match. The next day, Jim Neidhart was fired for refusing to take a drug test and throwing a television monitor backstage. And there it was, the beginning of the fall. Refusing a drug test speaks volumes without saying anything explicitly. The Federation didn't fire people capriciously in 1992. The company needed bodies, needed performers, needed draws. For Neidhart to be released suggested problems that went beyond mere creative differences. According to Bret Hart's own testimony, Neidhart had discovered crack cocaine, that particular demon that has destroyed so many lives across every stratum of society. The image is heartbreaking. Jim Neidhart and Davey Boy Smith, two cornerstones of tag team excellence, smoking crack in the weeks before SummerSlam 1992, while Bret desperately tried to prepare for the biggest match of his career. Neidhart drifted to the independent circuit, to Japan, to Australia, to WCW briefly, always moving, never settling, chasing something that had already slipped through his fingers. The pattern became depressingly consistent. Neidhart would return to the Federation, show flashes of his former capability, then be released again. In 1994, he returned as Owen Hart's ally during Owen's feud with Bret, adding depth to one of wrestling's most emotionally resonant storylines. But by December 1994, he was fired again for no-showing events. In 1996, he returned as Who, a comedy gimmick designed for terrible puns, a humiliation for a man who had once stood atop the industry. In 1997, he joined the reunited Hart Foundation, competing at the legendary Canadian Stampede show, only to be released again by December after Bret's departure following the Montreal Screwjob. Each return felt more desperate, each exit more inevitable. The wrestling business had moved on. The industry that had once needed Jim Neidhart no longer did. Neidhart's later years became a parade of indignities masked as opportunities. Independent shows, brief appearances, reality television through his daughter Natalia's role on Total Divas. In 2010, he was arrested for possession of controlled substances with intent to distribute, among other charges, after becoming aggressive with police while high on pills outside a gas station. This ultimately led to time spent in prison, followed by 2 stints in rehabilitation. But rehabilitation only works when the person wants to be rehabilitated, when they possess enough hope to believe recovery is possible. On August 13, 2018, Jim Neidhart died at age 63 in his home in Florida. His wife told investigators he'd been having trouble sleeping, got up to adjust the thermostat, turned strangely as if he were about to dance, then fell against the wall. He suffered a 4-inch gash on his face. Emergency services found him unresponsive. The preliminary investigation suggested he'd hit his head and succumbed to his injuries. His wife mentioned his doctors suspected Alzheimer's disease. The Anvil, who had once thrown an actual anvil 11 feet and set shot-put records that stood for over a decade, who had electrified crowds with his power and presence, died in the darkness of early morning from a fall. Wrestling history remembers the Hart Foundation as one of the greatest tag teams ever. When fans discuss that legendary partnership, they speak of innovation, execution, chemistry. They remember Bret Hart's ascension to icon status, his 5 championships, his reputation as excellence of execution. But they often forget Jim Neidhart, the man who helped make that rise possible, whose power created the space for Bret's technical mastery to flourish, whose presence completed the equation. The forgotten half of the Hart Foundation didn't receive a Hall of Fame induction during his lifetime. He received arrests, releases, and ultimately a tragic ending that befitted the arc of his story. Perhaps that's the cruelest aspect of tag team wrestling. Success requires 2 people, but immortality tends to be singular. One partner evolves into a singles star while the other becomes a footnote, a mere conversation starter. Jim Neidhart deserved better than obscurity, better than addiction, better than dying from a fall in the dark. He deserved to be remembered not as the forgotten half, but as the essential half, the foundation upon which legends were built, the anvil upon which excellence was forged. But Jim Neidhart, for all his strength, for all his contributions, never quite became the singles champion his talent suggested he could be. He became instead a cautionary tale about the distance between greatness and tragedy, and how sometimes that distance can be measured in a single year, a single decision, a single fall from which there is no recovery. May he rest in peace.